If you want to carry on with this example using my part, go ahead and open the SOLIDWORKS part Complex Part Design 3. But again, I encourage you to use your own file to help with the learning process. All right, at this point, we've made a good bit of progress. We started to create the middle section that really has the most curvature in our file. Because it changes its direction, it has tangency with the edges, but it sort of bumps in and bumps out. And this makes it very hard for us to create and blend it into the rest of the mouse. So now what we want to do is we want to look at the top view and we want to create some offset planes. So we have the front view, we're going to select, we're going to go up to reference geometry, and we're going to create a new plane. Let's go ahead and put in 25 and figure out if this is an area where we want to add another control curve. I think we want to push it back just a little bit farther, so let's go ahead and say 30, and that gives it more time to blend from this to whatever we create. We want to do this process one more time, select the front plane, reference geometry, and this time we're going to flip the offset. And again, I think 30 is probably a very good idea. Let's go ahead and say OK. And now what we've done is we've created two planes that allow us to create some reference sketches to help blend everything together. Now, there are a few ways that we can do this. We can use it to split the geometry by going to split line, or we can simply sketch on it and use the convert entities intersection curve option. Let's start by patching the back of this. So we're going to select plane 1 and we're going to sketch on it. We want to use the intersection curve option for both the boundary surface that we created and this little sliver of the helper surface on the bottom. Once we say OK, we'll convert both of those to construction and we'll start to sketch some geometry between it. In this case, I'm just going to use a standard spline because it's a little bit quicker for us to define. I'm going to create a tangency, the top edge, and a tangency with the bottom edge. You'll notice that when I do the tangencies, it's still underdefined. I can still increase the weight of the handles, even though the direction is already spoken for. So this gives me a little bit of flexibility. If I were to do something like equal curvature, it would not only show the tangency as being fully defined, but it also would fully define the weight because that's how it handles the curvature going between these two. I'm going to simply move them around until I get really a good looking curvature. I want to make this bottom one a little bit tighter here, and I'm going to make this top one a little bit broader. Because remember, we're going to be going from this edge, this surface, and blending into this. So now that we created that, let's say OK, select plane 1, and go ahead and hide it. So now again, let's create a boundary surface, and we're going to go from this top edge to this bottom edge again. And again, we want to drag these endpoints back because we're not going to go all the way into that corner, again, because of that degenerate point issue I was talking about. For direction 2, we're going to select the edge of our recently created surface, and then we want to select this sketch. Now we have to go back and make sure that we have tangency. So with this purple edge, direction 2, make sure that we have tangency to face. With this blue edge, make sure we have tangency to face, tangency to face. Now notice as it comes through, it goes from this purple edge and it blends into this curve that we created. Now we do have some options. We can adjust the influence, but in this case, I want to leave the influence at 0 and let my curvature inside of these sketches do the talking. So you notice what happens is it goes from this sort of sharp transition edge and it blends down into this sketch. Now, as we're looking at this, if this isn't the ideal curvature, we'd have to go back inside of our boundary surface and manipulate either this sketch or the location of its plane. Let's select that 30 millimeter dimension. Let's change it to 35 and notice how it pushes that curve sketch 14 back. Now, if we're still not happy with this, we can push it back a little bit further or we can manipulate that curve. But one thing that I want to note is this edge right here, we need to be very careful that we're not creating some bad geometry. So I'm going to go back into boundary surface 4, and I want to take a look at this edge. I want to move this point around to make sure that the curvature that's created is something that's going to be a nice transition for us. This is something that you'll probably have to go back and play around with because this really doesn't have any good defining characteristics. It's just something that you need to manipulate, play with, and take a look at the final result. Now, that's not a really good result. Back into boundary surface, I'm going to drag them a little bit closer to my sketch. That way it gives it more time to transition. It looks like a much better reference here. So now I'm going to take these, and again, I'm going to knit everything together. And the reason I do is because, again, it makes that selection process much easier on the backside. But notice one thing. At this edge, we have a solid black line. It's not a dashed black line. That means that something happened with the tangency. If we go up to our display style, you notice that we have a sharp edge there. So we need to be extra careful, go back into boundary surface, and notice that we accidentally turn the tangency off. And this happens quite a bit because once this box is selected, If you use the wheel on your mouse when it's over it, it can change that option. So you need to be extra careful, make sure that you have tangency across these edges and you're seeing this dashed line if you change your settings like mine, or if you turn them off, that you don't have a sharp edge there. Now you will notice the transition here does look a little funny as well. If you notice that, you can always go back in and play around by giving it a curvature to face option. A lot of times the curvature to face option will allow it to blend a little bit better, and you can take a look at the results. Now we want to handle this back section, this patch. And because it's a three-sided patch, we can do two different options. We can select filled surface, or we can try to do a lofted surface. Now I found that boundary surface doesn't really handle these very well, so I would suggest going directly to a lofted surface first and going from this edge to this edge. And for your guide curve, use this edge. And make sure that all of them have tangency. Tangency to face, and for your start and end constraints, make sure they have tangency to face. Once we say OK, you notice that the loft operation fails. Now this does happen from time to time, especially when you try to push tangency. So what we want to do is we want to exit out of here and try the filled surface. Now because our options for selection are pretty limited, we can right click and we can just say select open loop, apply to all edges a tangent relation, and say OK. So notice that this one patches just fine, whereas the original loft that we tried failed. And oftentimes that does happen when you have a triangular patch. It's not a really good option. So when you fall in that line, try the loft first, but ultimately fall back into the filled surface, but make sure that the final result looks okay. Now moving on to the front. Let's select plane 2, start a new sketch, use our intersection curve, and again, grab the faces that they're going to intersect, and then convert them to construction geometry. Now, one thing you notice is going from this patch here to this patch here, the transition doesn't look real great. Now, if you'll remember, I did a style spline here and I used a standard spline for this curvature here. Now with the style spline, I added multiple collinear relations at the top and the bottom to give me better continuity. Whereas I just had really a standard spline here and I really didn't have great control over the curvature. So this is something to note here, and we'll go back and approach it after we create these surfaces. Let's go ahead and use a style spline. Start at this point, drag a couple points out, a couple points down, and then look at this thing in a normal 2 view. So we want to take this first edge and make sure that it's either collinear or tangent with the bottom. Then we're going to take this top edge, make sure that it's collinear or tangent with the top. And then we can add some collinear relations to these control edges. So once we have that, we really need to determine what we want this blended shape to look like. Now remember, we are transitioning from this edge down to this shape and ultimately into a triangular patch again. So I'm going to pull these in and I'm going to try to blend it in nice and softly. And I think that's a pretty good result. I'm going to hide plane 2, and this time I'm going to create a boundary surface. I'm going to go from this upper edge to this lower edge. And again, these endpoints, I want to make sure I drag them in. And then my direction 2 is going to be this edge and my sketch. Now, again, we want to make sure that we apply at least a tangency relation and take a look at the results. So this is a pretty nice blend, but I think I want to drag this back a little bit closer to my sketch and move some of these boxes out of the way to make sure that I'm getting a very good understanding of this. Now, one other thing we can do is we can scroll all the way down into the curvature display. We can increase the mesh density, which might give us a little bit better idea what the curvature is doing. We can turn on zebra stripes, or we can turn on curvature combs. Now with the curvature combs, you have scale and density. We can bring them in a little bit. We can kick the density up and maybe get a pretty decent idea. But notice that with the curvature combs, it really is going to increase the number of curves based on your mesh density. So you might need to turn your mesh density down just a little bit to take a look at it. Let's go ahead and say OK and create the surface. Let's knit these together and notice again that we don't have a dashed line here. So we'll go back into the boundary surface, and again, it was removed by using the mouse wheel. So this is a pretty big transition here, and I don't really like the way it's transitioning from this edge, so we need to go back into Sketch 15 and manipulate it just a little bit more. So I'm going to pull these lines in, and then I want to make this go into a slight concave transition. Say OK, and take a look at the results. Now I think that's a little bit better transition. It's still pretty harsh, but let's go ahead and move forward with it. We want to do a filled surface, right click and select open loop, and apply tangency to all edges. I'm going to scroll down, I'm going to turn off my curvature combs and say OK. So that's a pretty nice patch here. We can knit that together along with the back edge and say okay. Now, as we're looking at this mouse, we have a pretty harsh transition here. And as it comes out and it bumps out and it tries to blend back in, you can see that it's not doing a very good job because we really have some pretty extreme curves here. But what we want to do is we want to go back to Sketch 13 using the new 2016 breadcrumbs feature and edit that sketch. So inside here, we can pull this out. We can make this curvature a little bit less extreme and get a much nicer transition between everything. Let's go ahead and do a save as, add a number 4 after the file, and then we can come back in the next video and we can patch the rest of the right side.